morning mist hung low over the ranch as Arthur Miller prepared to leave, unaware that one quiet moment was about to change everything. The horses shifted near the gate. The stagecoach waited. Arthur had made this journey many times before, and nothing about this morning seemed unusual, until a young girl appeared beside him. She did not explain herself. She only looked up at the wealthy cowboy and spoke 4 words that made him stop.
Don't talk. Follow me.
Arthur had no idea why she was so afraid, or what she had seen.
If you get inside that coach, you will not come back.
But before long, he would understand why she had come to him. He had been walking toward the polished black stagecoach waiting near the main gate. His leather travel bag was in one hand, his riding crop in the other. His mind was already 3 days ahead, sitting in a velvet-lined parlor in Denver negotiating grazing rights. Now, he stood perfectly still on the packed dirt, looking down at a 10-year-old girl in a faded cotton dress. She had slipped out from behind the heavy timber of the stables as if she had been waiting in the cold for hours. "What is it?" Arthur asked gently. He knew the girl. Her name was Ellie. She was the daughter of Tess, the widow who kept the main house and cooked his meals. He had seen Ellie 100 times carrying heavy water pails across the yard or sweeping the wraparound porch, but he could not recall ever speaking more than a passing greeting to her. "Don't talk," Ellie repeated, her voice tighter this time. "Please, sir, follow me. Don't let the man on the coach see your face." Arthur glanced toward the main gate. The heavy black carriage stood ready. The driver was sitting up high on the box, holding the reins of 4 restless bays. The horses were stamping the dirt, breath pluming in the crisp 1888 morning air. Everything looked as it did every time Arthur traveled. The ranch was quiet. The sky was a pale, clear blue. "Ellie, I have a train to catch in town," Arthur said, keeping his voice low and patient. "If there is trouble with your mother, I can leave money." Ellie did not let go of his coat. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her blue eyes were not the eyes of a flustered child. They were the eyes of someone who had spent the entire night staring at the dark. "If you get inside that coach," Ellie whispered, her knuckles turning white, "you will not come back. I heard them in the parlor last night. Please." Arthur felt a sudden, icy stillness settle in his chest. He pushed the feeling aside. He had built the largest cattle and rail empire in the territory on a foundation of cold logic. He had survived rustlers, blizzards, and ruthless businessmen by never reacting blindly to a surprise. He did not alter his plans because a frightened girl grabbed his coat. But there was a desperate certainty in Ellie's grip that made him look a second time at the stagecoach. He looked closely. The carriage was his. The horses were his. The driver sitting high on the box was wearing the same brown duster and the same battered felt hat that his loyal foreman, Charles, always wore. The man was the same broad-shouldered build. Everything was perfect, except for one detail. Charles, a man who had ridden with Arthur for 5 hard years, wore a thick silver ring on his left hand. It was a Navajo piece, a gift from his late mother. Charles never took it off. Not when breaking wild horses, not when washing up for supper. Arthur had once offered to buy him a better ring, and Charles had politely told him that all the gold in the territory could not buy that silver band. The man holding the reins was wearing thick leather work gloves. Charles never wore gloves when driving. He always said he needed to feel the horses' mouths through the leather lines. "How do you know what you heard?" Arthur asked. His voice was entirely empty of its previous warmth. His eyes remained locked on the driver. "Because they said your name," Ellie whispered. "They said it 3 times. The man told your wife he wanted the second half of the money as soon as the carriage went over the edge at Ocrea's Run." Arthur's lungs stopped working. He felt his breath halt, then start again in a slow, measured rhythm, the same bodily reaction he had whenever he found a rattlesnake coiled near his boot. "Walk with me," Arthur said quietly, slowly, toward the back of the stables. "Do not run. Do not look at the gate." Ellie nodded once and released his coat. They walked side by side across the yard, past the large wooden water trough, and around the heavy oak beams of the barn. Once the carriage was out of sight, Arthur knelt in the hay-strewn dirt, so he was eye level with the girl. Ellie was not a girl prone to panic. Her grandfather had been a major in the Union Army, a legendary cavalryman who rode deep behind Confederate lines to sabotage supply trains during the bloodiest years of the Civil War. He had raised Ellie on stark stories of survival, teaching her how to hold her nerve when the world caught fire. That inherited, quiet iron was exactly what Arthur saw in her face now. "Tell me everything," Arthur said. "Do not skip a detail. Start from last night." Ellie took a slow, steadying breath. "My mother was resting. It was past midnight. I went to the main house to bank the fires in the stoves so the house would be warm for you this morning. The lamps were low. As I passed the parlor doors, I heard voices." "Who?" "Your wife," Ellie said, her voice dropping. "Miss Molly. And a man. I had never heard his voice before. It was deep, like he had dust in his throat." Arthur kept his face perfectly still. "Miss Molly told him that the route was set," Ellie continued. "She said you always travel the same way. You get in the coach, you pull the curtains to block the sun, and you read your ledgers until you reach the station. She said you wouldn't even notice Charles wasn't driving until it was too late." Ellie paused. The memory seemed to physically weigh on her narrow shoulders. The man asked if she was sure the drop at O'Cree's Run was steep enough. Miss Molly laughed. She said a wagon went over 2 winters ago, and they didn't find the bodies until the spring thaw. Arthur listened to the sound of his own pulse drumming in his ears. The foundation of his life, his grand house, his sprawling acres, his beautiful, refined wife who had poured his coffee just an hour ago, was suddenly dissolving into ash. "Is that all?" Arthur asked softly. "No," Ellie said. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, worn leather ledger. The man stepped out onto the porch to smoke. When he came back inside, he dropped this near the boot scraper. "I waited until they went to the study, and I took it." Arthur took the small book. He opened it carefully. Inside, written in sharp, heavy pencil, was a list of names, dates, and bank figures. On the final page, his own name was written: Arthur Miller. Accident, Mountain Pass, payment, $10,000 up front, $10,000 upon reading of the will. There was no denying the reality in front of him. His life had ended while he slept under his own roof. Arthur looked at Ellie. "Does your mother know about this?" "No, sir. She was asleep. If I woke her, she would have lit a lantern and made a fuss." The man might have seen. "You did the right thing," Arthur said, slipping the ledger into his coat pocket. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Ellie. What you did this morning is the bravest thing I have ever witnessed. You saved my life. Do you understand that?" Ellie swallowed hard and nodded. "Now," Arthur said, "I need you to go back to your mother's cabin. Tell her you feel sick to your stomach. Tell her you need to lie down. Do not mention me. Do not mention the carriage. If anyone asks, you haven't seen me since yesterday. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Go." He watched the blonde girl slip away toward the workers' cabins, moving quietly through the shadows. Arthur stood up, brushed the dirt from his trousers, and adjusted his hat. He walked out from behind the stables, stepping back into the morning sun, his face a mask of absolute calm. He did not walk toward the carriage. Instead, he turned and marched up the wooden steps of the main house. Arthur stepped into the grand foyer of the main house. The air inside smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a heavy, rhythmic weight. It was a house he had built from the ground up, paying for every nail and floorboard with years of back-breaking labor. Now, it felt like a tomb. He found his wife in the parlor. Molly was standing by the large bay window. The morning sunlight caught the fine, dark fabric of her dress. She turned when she heard his boots on the hardwood. Her smile was soft, familiar, and perfectly composed. "Arthur," she said, her voice carrying a note of mild surprise. "I thought you were already on the road. The driver has been waiting." Arthur looked at the woman he had married 5 years ago. He remembered the small church in Valentine. He remembered the way she had tended to him when he broke his ribs breaking a wild Mustang. He searched her face for any trace of malice, any crack in the porcelain surface. There was nothing. Just the cool, patient calculation of a woman who was already spending his ghost's money. "I forgot the grazing deeds for the northern ridge," Arthur said. His voice was steady. It was the same flat, commanding tone he used when negotiating cattle prices. "I cannot meet the buyers in Denver without them." "Oh," Molly said, She took a step toward him. "Shall I help you look? They must be in your study." "No need. I know exactly where they are." Arthur walked past her. He stopped just long enough to kiss her lightly on the cheek. She wore rosewater, the same scent he had bought for her on a trip to Saint Denis last spring. "Do hurry, darling," Molly said softly. "The mountain passes get dangerous if you lose the daylight." "I know," Arthur replied. He did not look back. "I always watch the road." Arthur did not go to the study. He walked straight through the kitchen, slipped out the heavy oak back door, and moved quickly through the tall orchard grass behind the house. He bypassed the main stables and headed toward a small, weathered cabin near the tree line. It was where his foreman lived. Charles was sitting on his porch, polishing a repeating rifle. He was dressed in his work clothes, but his boots were off. When he saw Arthur approaching from the tall grass instead of the main path, Charles set the rifle down. He stood up, his dark eyes narrowing. "Boss," Charles said, stepping off the porch. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be halfway to the station by now." Arthur stopped at the edge of the porch. "Charles, why are you not driving my coach this morning?" Charles frowned, genuinely confused. "You sent me a telegram from town yesterday, said you hired a private transport company from Blackwater to take you, and that I should take 2 days rest." "I sent no telegram," Arthur said quietly. Charles froze. The easy morning stillness shattered instantly. Charles had survived the Indian Wars and countless outlaws. He knew what a lie like that meant. He reached back and picked up his rifle, racking the lever with a sharp, metallic clack. "Who is on the box of your coach right now?" Charles asked. "A dead man, if he stays there long enough," Arthur said. He pulled the small leather ledger from his pocket. "Saddle your horse, Charles. Keep it quiet. Do not use the main road. We are riding into town, and we are not taking the coach." "Miss Molly?" Charles asked, his voice low. "She is in the parlor," Arthur said, the exhaustion finally creeping into his tone. "Waiting for me to die." Charles did not offer pity. He knew Arthur would not want it. He simply nodded. "I will be ready in 2 minutes. We take the ridge trail." The ride to town took 40 minutes. The ridge trail kept them hidden beneath a thick canopy of pine and spruce. Arthur rode his gray thoroughbred, his mind racing faster than the horse's hooves. They arrived at the back alley of Valentine, tying their horses behind a sturdy brick building. A wooden sign above the door read, "Hosea Matthews, Attorney at Law." Hosea was an older man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating mind. He had been Arthur's legal counsel for 15 years. He was sitting at his cluttered mahogany desk, sipping black coffee, when Arthur and Charles walked through the back door unannounced. Hosea took one look at Arthur's face and set his coffee cup down. "Lock the door, Charles," Hosea said. He pulled the blinds shut. "Arthur, sit down. You look like you've seen a ghost." "I almost became one," Arthur said. He dropped the leather ledger onto Hosea's desk. Then, he sat in the leather chair and spoke. He told Hosea everything. He spoke in short, factual sentences. He explained the fake driver, the forged telegram, Ellie's warning, and the conversation in the parlor. Hosea did not interrupt. He opened the ledger, adjusting his spectacles. He studied the sharp, heavy handwriting. He traced the numbers and the name with a steady finger. When Arthur finished, the room was completely silent. Only the muffled sounds of horses and wagons in the street outside could be heard. "I pulled your will and the deed to the ranch from the bank vault last week," Hosea said quietly. "Molly requested a review of the documents. She said you wanted to make sure everything was in order before your trip to Denver." "I never asked for that," Arthur said. "I know," Hosea replied, "but as your wife, she has legal standing to review the estate. If you die, Arthur, everything goes to her. The land, the livestock, the rail shares. It is worth nearly $1 million. Once the mourning period passes, she could liquidate the entire empire and disappear." Charles leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "The man in the ledger. Who is he?" Hosea opened a heavy wooden filing cabinet behind his desk. "I have a friend, a Pinkerton agent operating out of Blackwater. Name is Joel. He owes me a favor. Let me send a wire. If this man is a professional killer, the Pinkertons will have a file on him." "Do it," Arthur said, "but do it quietly. I need to know his name." Back at the ranch, the morning sun was climbing higher. Molly paced the length of the parlor. Her silk dress rustled against the Persian rug. She checked the grandfather clock. It had been 45 minutes since Arthur went to find his deeds. She walked to the window. The black stagecoach was still waiting at the gate. The driver was sitting rigidly on the box. Molly felt a faint prickle of unease. Arthur was a punctual man. He hated delaying business. She turned and walked down the long hallway toward his study. She opened the heavy oak door. The room was empty. The ledgers were sitting neatly on the desk. "Arthur?" she called out. No answer. She walked to the kitchen. The cast-iron stove was warm, but the room was empty. She stepped out onto the back porch. The wind blew softly through the orchard. She saw Tess, the housekeeper, carrying a basket of wet laundry toward the clothesline. "Tess," Molly called out, keeping her voice light and casual. "Have you seen my husband?" Tess stopped. She was a hardened woman who had buried a husband and raised a child alone. She wiped her hands on her apron. "No, Miss Molly, I haven't seen Mr. Arthur since yesterday evening. I thought he was traveling today." Molly smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "He is. He must be out at the stables. Thank you, Tess." Molly walked quickly toward the main gate. The dirt crunched under her boots. The fake driver looked down at her from the high seat. "Where is he?" the driver asked. His voice was indeed deep, carrying the rough grit of road dust. "He went for some papers," Molly said, her heart beating a little faster now. "He hasn't come out." The driver's eyes narrowed. "I checked the stables. His gray horse is gone. So is the foreman." Molly froze. The quiet ranch suddenly felt vast and threatening. "Did he see you?" "I don't know," the driver spat. "But he didn't get in the carriage." Molly closed her eyes. The plan was fraying, but she was a woman who had clawed her way out of poverty, and she was not going to let $1 million slip through her fingers because of a delayed schedule. "Take the carriage back to town," Molly ordered. "Leave it at the livery. Act perfectly normal. If anyone asks, say the trip was canceled. Find out where he went." In the back office of Valentine, the telegraph machine clicked furiously. Hosea tore the paper strip from the machine and read it over. His face, usually a mask of calm professionalism, grew tight. He walked back to his desk and looked at Arthur. "Joel found him," Hosea said. "The ledger matches a handwriting sample from a case in St. Denis 3 years ago." Arthur sat forward. "Give me the name." "His real name is Micah Bell," Hosea read from the paper. "He is not just a hired gun. He is an inheritance specialist." "A what?" Charles asked. "He preys on wealthy, isolated targets," Hosea explained. "He finds a discontented spouse, helps them engineer an accident, and takes a massive cut of the inheritance. He's wanted for 2 similar deaths in New Hanover. A logging baron died in a hunting accident. A shipping merchant drowned in a river. Both deaths looked completely natural. Both widows disappeared a year later with Micah Bell." Arthur felt the coldness settle deeper into his bones. Molly had not merely made a mistake. She had invited a serpent into his home. "What do we do, boss?" Charles asked, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "I can ride back there right now. I can drag him off that carriage and handle him." "No," Arthur said. His voice was sharp. "If you kill him, Molly claims she knew nothing. She plays the grieving wife. She still gets everything, and we become the murderers. The law will hang us, Charles." "So we go to the sheriff," Hosea suggested. "We show him the ledger." Arthur shook his head. "The ledger has my name and a price. It proves someone wants me dead, but it does not prove Molly is part of it. A clever lawyer would say Micah stole the book, or that it's a forgery. We need ironclad proof. We need to catch them in the act." "How?" Hosea asked. Arthur looked at the map of the territory hanging on Hosea's wall. He traced the line of the stagecoach route with his eyes, stopping at a sharp bend labeled O'Crea's Run. "We let them try again," Arthur said softly. Hosea stared at him. "Arthur, that is suicide." "It is justice," Arthur corrected. "Molly thinks I missed the carriage by chance. She will regroup. She will try to force the trip again, and when she does, I will be in that coach." Arthur stood up, adjusting his coat. The heartbreak he had felt an hour ago was gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding iron of a man who had built a kingdom out of the dirt. "Charles," Arthur said, "ride back to the ranch. Keep out of sight. Keep an eye on Ellie and her mother. If Micah goes near that girl, shoot him. Do not ask questions. Just shoot him. You have my word, Charles said. Hosea, Arthur turned to the lawyer. Wire your Pinkerton friend. Tell Joel to meet us near O'Cree's Run tomorrow at dawn. Bring enough men to block a mountain pass. Arthur picked up his hat. Where are you going? Hosea asked. I am going back to my wife, Arthur said. I have a train to catch. Arthur rode back onto his property just as the afternoon sun began to bleed orange and bruised purple across the horizon. He handed his tired gray horse to a stable hand and walked toward the main house. The evening air was turning cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and wood smoke. He stepped into the hallway and removed his hat. He could hear the soft clinking of silverware from the dining room. He walked in. Molly was already seated at the long mahogany table. A roast sat in the center, flanked by fresh bread and roasted root vegetables. She looked up, her face a perfect portrait of wifely relief. Arthur, she breathed, placing her napkin on the table. I was beginning to worry. The driver returned to town. He said you never came out of the house. Arthur pulled out his heavy wooden chair and sat down at the head of the table. He looked at the food, then at her. I lost track of time, Arthur said smoothly. He poured himself a glass of water. I found the deeds, but I noticed a discrepancy in the boundary lines. I had to ride out to the surveyor's post to double-check the markers. It took hours. Molly watched him carefully. Is everything in order now? Yes, Arthur said. I sent a wire to Denver. The meeting is pushed back one day. I will take the coach tomorrow morning at first light. Molly smiled. The tension in her shoulders vanished, melting away like snow on a warm stove. That is wonderful news. I was so afraid you had canceled the trip entirely. Denver is so important for the ranch. It is, Arthur agreed. He picked up his fork. They ate their dinner together. Molly spoke about her garden. She spoke about ordering new curtains for the guest rooms from a catalog in Saint Denis. Arthur listened. He nodded at the right times. He chewed his food, though it tasted like dry ash in his mouth. He watched the candlelight flicker across her beautiful face. He realized, with a profound and quiet sadness, that the woman sitting across from him was entirely empty. There was no soul behind her smile, only arithmetic. She was already spending the money from his grave. When dinner was over, Molly stood up and came around the table. She placed her hands on his shoulders and kissed the top of his head. Rest well tonight, my love, she whispered. Tomorrow is a long journey. I will, Arthur said. The house grew entirely quiet by midnight. Arthur lay in his bed, staring up at the dark timber ceiling. He did not sleep. Outside, the wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the window panes. Down near the workers' cabins, Charles sat in the cold shadows of the stables. The foreman had a thick blanket draped over his shoulders, and his repeating rifle resting across his knees. He did not light a lantern. He did not smoke his pipe. He simply watched the small, darkened window of Tess and Ellie's cabin. Charles knew what betrayal looked like. He had seen it in the war. He had seen it in mining camps. But seeing it here, in the home of a man who had treated him fairly for 5 years, filled him with a cold, steady anger. He watched the tree line until the sun finally began to turn the eastern sky a pale, dirty gray. No one approached the cabin. Micah Bell was waiting for the morning. At 6 o'clock, the black stagecoach was waiting at the main gate. The frost was thick on the ground, crunching under Arthur's boots as he walked down the front steps. Molly stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl. She waved to him. Arthur touched the brim of his hat in return. He did not look back again. Micah Bell was sitting on the driver's box. He wore the same brown duster and battered hat, mimicking Charles perfectly from a distance. "Morning, boss," Micah grunted, keeping his head down and his voice deliberately rough. "Morning," Arthur said. He climbed into the carriage and shut the heavy door. The carriage lurched forward. The 4 horses pulled them away from the ranch, the wooden wheels grinding against the frozen dirt. Inside the cabin, Arthur sat in the center of the leather bench. He did not pull the curtains, he did not open his ledgers, he simply unbuttoned his heavy coat, reached into his holster, and pulled out his heavy cavalry revolver. He rested the weapon quietly on his lap. For 2 hours, they rode through the winding mountain roads. The trail grew steeper. The tall pines crowded in on both sides, blocking out the morning sun. The air grew thinner and colder. The only sounds were the cracking of the whip, the snorting of the horses, and the relentless creak of the wooden carriage. Arthur felt the road begin to tilt. They were approaching the high pass. O'Cree's Run. It was a notorious stretch of trail. The road was narrow, hugging a sheer cliff face. On the left side, a jagged wall of rock reached up toward the sky. On the right, there was a 300-foot drop into a rocky ravine filled with freezing, rushing water. A heavy wagon pushed over that edge would shatter into kindling. A man inside would not survive. The carriage began to slow down. Arthur's thumb rested on the hammer of his revolver. The coach ground to a halt. The wheels locked. The horses stamped nervously, sensing the dangerous edge. Above him, Arthur heard the heavy boots of the driver stepping down from the box. Micah dropped to the dirt with a soft thud. Footsteps crunched slowly along the side of the carriage. Micah was walking toward the passenger door. He was not rushing. He had all the time in the world. He stopped right outside Arthur's door. Arthur heard the sharp, metallic click of a gun being cocked. Suddenly, the carriage door swung open. Micah Bell stood there, a cruel smirk twisting his scarred face. He had his pistol aimed directly into the dark cabin. "End of the line, Mr. Miller," Micah sneered. Arthur did not raise his hands. He did not beg. He looked calmly at the barrel of the gun, then looked up at Micah's face. "You should look behind you," Arthur said softly. Micah's smirk faltered. He heard the sound of sliding rocks. "Drop it," a voice boomed from the cliff wall. Micah spun around. From the rocky ridge above the road, 3 men stood with rifles leveled squarely at his chest. They wore the dark coats and silver badges of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Agent Joel stood in the center, his face like carved stone. Before Micah could raise his weapon to fire, a heavy shadow dropped from the roof of the carriage. Charles landed squarely on Micah's back. The impact drove the outlaw face first into the frozen dirt. Micah's pistol fired into the air, the gunshot echoing wildly across the ravine. Charles grabbed Micah by his coat collar and hauled him up, slamming him brutally against the side of the carriage. He pressed the barrel of his repeating rifle directly under Micah's chin. "Give me a reason," Charles whispered. "Just twitch." Micah froze. His eyes darted from Charles to the Pinkertons moving down the ridge, and finally to Arthur, who was stepping out of the carriage. Arthur holstered his revolver and buttoned his coat against the wind. "You're a long way from Saint Denis, Mr. Bell," Arthur said. Micah spat blood into the dirt. He tried to force a defiant grin, but his hands were shaking. "You think you're smart, Miller? Your own wife bought the ticket. She paid me." "I know," Arthur said. He nodded to the Pinkertons. "Take him to the federal jail in Blackwater. Make sure he does not fall off a cliff on the way." Agent Joel stepped forward, slapping heavy iron cuffs on Micah's wrists. "He won't fall. He's going to hang, and he's going to tell a judge exactly who paid him to do this." Arthur looked over the edge of the cliff. The drop was terrifying. The water raged far below. He had built his life on trust, on hard work, and on the belief that a man's home was his castle. But standing on the edge of the abyss, he realized how fragile it all was. It could all be undone by a whisper in the dark. "Let's go home, Charles," Arthur said quietly. Charles kept his eyes locked on Micah as the Pinkertons dragged him away. "What about her, boss?" "Her ride is already waiting," Arthur replied. When Arthur and Charles rode back through the gates of the ranch later that afternoon, the yard was not quiet. 2 local lawmen's wagons were parked near the front porch. The local sheriff was standing by the steps, holding his hat. Hosea Matthews stood beside him, holding his leather briefcase. Arthur dismounted. He walked up the steps and stepped into his foyer. Molly was sitting in the parlor. Her face was pale, completely drained of the confident warmth she had worn the night before. She was looking at Hosea's ledgers spread out on the coffee table. When she saw Arthur walk into the room, she gasped. She put her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. "Arthur!" she cried out, standing up. "Thank God! The sheriff just arrived. They told me the carriage was attacked. I was so afraid you were dead." She rushed toward him, her arms outstretched to embrace him. Arthur did not move. He did not catch her. He simply stood there like a great oak tree. Molly stopped just a foot away, her arms slowly falling to her sides. She looked into his eyes. She saw no anger. She saw no grief. She saw absolute, unyielding coldness. The kind of coldness that comes right before a terrible winter. "He did not attack the carriage, Molly," Arthur said, his voice quiet enough to force everyone in the room to listen. "He stopped it, exactly where you told him to." Molly stepped back. Her breathing became shallow. "Arthur, I don't know what you are talking about. Someone is lying to you." Hosea stepped into the room. "Micah Bell confessed, Mrs. Miller. The Pinkertons offered him a chance to avoid the rope if he gave them a full statement. He provided the exact details of your arrangement. He also provided the other half of the telegrams you sent to Blackwater." Molly looked at Hosea, then at the sheriff, and finally back at Arthur. The corner of her mouth trembled. The elegant, refined facade shattered, leaving only the desperate reality of a trapped animal. "You gave everything to this ranch," she whispered bitterly, the tears finally real. "You loved the dirt more than you loved me. I just wanted my share." "You had my name," Arthur said. "You had my home. That was your share." He turned his back to her and nodded to the sheriff. "Take her," Arthur said. He walked out of the parlor and onto the back porch. He did not stay to watch them put her in the wagon. He did not want that to be his final memory of her. He stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing, and watched the sun dip behind the mountains. The long shadow of his house stretched out across the yard. The fever had finally broken. The winter came and went. The ranch changed. It did not feel empty, despite Molly's absence. Instead, it felt like a building that had finally been aired out after a long illness. Arthur spent more time riding with his men. He gave Charles a full share in the northern cattle herd. He ate his meals in the kitchen with the ranch hands, rather than sitting alone in the grand dining room. The trial in Blackwater had been swift. Micah Bell was sent to the territorial prison to await the gallows. Molly had pleaded guilty to conspiracy, and was serving 20 years in a federal women's penitentiary. Arthur never visited her. He never read the letters she sent. Spring brought green shoots through the thawing mud, and warm winds from the south. One afternoon, Arthur was walking near the newly repaired timber fences when he saw Ellie. The blonde girl was sitting on a wooden crate near the stables, holding a worn book. She was reading aloud, practicing her letters. Her mother, Tess, was nearby, beating a rug on the clothesline. Arthur walked over. Ellie looked up, quickly closing the book in her lap. "Afternoon, Mr. Miller," Ellie said, standing up out of respect. "Sit down, Ellie," Arthur said gently. He leaned against the fence, tipping his hat back. "What are you reading?" "A history book, sir," Ellie said softly. "It belonged to my grandfather." Arthur nodded. "Your mother told me about him. Major Samuel Allen, 3rd Cavalry, a brave man who rode behind enemy lines to save a lot of good soldiers." Ellie's face brightened with a sudden, fierce pride. "He was the bravest man I ever knew. He taught me how to shoot and how to read the stars. He told me that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own, but by what they are willing to risk for someone else." "He was a smart man," Arthur said. He looked out over the rolling green hills of his land. "Ellie, I never properly thanked you for that morning. You risked your position here. You risked your mother's livelihood. If you had been wrong, or if I had not believed you, Micah Bell would have likely killed you too." "I knew what I heard, sir," Ellie said firmly. "My grandfather always said, if you see a fire starting, you don't wait for someone else to fetch the water." Arthur chuckled softly. It was a good, deep sound that had been missing from the ranch for years. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. He handed it to the girl. Ellie took it carefully. "What is this?" "I spoke with Hosea," Arthur explained. "There is a fine academy for young women in Saint Denis. They teach history, mathematics, and law. That envelope contains a letter of admission, paid in full for 4 years. The train leaves next week." Ellie stared at the envelope. Her hands began to tremble, much like they had that morning by the stables, but this time it was not out of fear. She looked up at Arthur, her blue eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Miller, we cannot accept this. It is too much." "It is not a gift," Arthur corrected her, his voice entirely serious. "It is an investment. I have spent my life building a business. I know a good investment when I see one. You have the courage of a Union major in your chest, Ellie. I will not let you spend your life sweeping my porches. Tess, who had stopped beating the rug, walked over. She wiped her hands on her apron, looking at the envelope and then at Arthur. There were tears shining in the older woman's eyes. You do not owe us this, Arthur, Tess said quietly, dropping the formal Mr. Miller for the first time in years. Tess, Arthur said, turning to the housekeeper, you and your daughter gave me my life back. And more importantly, you showed me who actually belongs in it. He looked back down at Ellie, who was clutching the envelope to her chest as if it were made of solid gold. Study hard, Ellie, Arthur said, his tone carrying a gentle, dignified humor. If you become half as smart as Hosea, I might hire you to run my books one day. Ellie smiled, a bright, unbroken smile that seemed to light up the dusty yard. I will, sir, I promise. Arthur tipped his hat to them both. He turned and walked back toward the main house. The wind was warm against his face. He listened to the sound of the horses in the pasture and the distant whistle of a train winding its way through the valley. He had walked out of his front door months ago, surrounded by enemies disguised as family. Today he was walking on his own land, surrounded by family he had never realized he had. He climbed the porch steps, pushed open the heavy oak door, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt